Thank you, Josh. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to someone who I'm sure actually needs no introduction to you. That is Dr. Roy Anderson, who's going to be doing our keynote address. Roy has had a lifelong interest in nature and wildlife, but early on it became directed towards small obscure families within the Coleoptera particularly, such as the Staphylinidae and non-marine mollusca. Roy has published over 300 notes, observations, papers on Irish wildlife, and 6 books. He's been awarded a fellowship of the Royal Entomological Society in 2008 and was editor of the Journal of Conchology from 2008 to 2014. He was awarded Recorder of the Year by the National Biodiversity Centre in 2011. He continues to produce site and species reviews on a regular basis for government agencies in both parts of Ireland, as well as for conservation NGOs. And recently he was notified that he's going to be awarded an MBE for services to nature and science in Northern Ireland. So we are very proud to be having Roy come and address us now. Thank you.
Well, here I am again. I seem to do this every so often. My talk, before I start, oops, that wasn't a good start. Nearly wrecked the place by turning the computer around. Is there a problem with that? Thank you. My problem is age. I'm trying to look at the screen here and the screen here at the same time. So I thought I would turn this around a little bit to ease the difficulties. Before I start my talk, I'd like to pay tribute to a guy that most of you won't know, probably haven't even heard of, and that's Mike Bryan. Mike Bryan came to Northern Ireland in the early 2000s and settled in to the local environment. I met him in 2008. I think Brian Nelson was there at that meeting at Brackenbog, if you remember Brian. Mike is a collector, foremost and everywhere a collector of ancient muskets, butterflies, and more latterly, Coleoptera beetles. And he is a phenomenal collector. His butterfly collection is something to be seen. I didn't know what I was taking on when I developed a friendship with Mike, and we went out together to various spots around Northern Ireland and started collecting beetles. Mike is a very industrious setter of beetles. He will dissect beetles, he will present them to me, and I spend a lot of time with Mike's beetles. Over the last 10 years, he's presented me with something like 3,000 species minimum per year and up to 8,000 to be identified. So Mike is very industrious in collecting, in setting, in dissecting, but he doesn't go any further. So he leaves that up to me. And I have to admit, there have been times when my temper became quite short with Mike because of the amount of stuff he was producing. The current talk actually depends to a large extent upon this activity and the results derived therefrom. So I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about biodiversity in Ireland. This is going to sound a bit like teaching a granny to suck eggs, but for the benefit of those people who aren't familiar with the subject, I'd like to sort of concentrate for a moment on the position of Ireland in Europe and its effect upon our native biodiversity. Small size of an island, geographically isolated, separated from Britain and continent early on in the post-glacial period, cloudy, cold climate, early onset of agriculture, historically large rural population, a combination of factors which has led to Ireland being on the bottom rung of biodiversity in Europe in many respects, and particularly in terms of woodland fauna, because the area of our woodlands is so depleted here in Ireland. If we look at Irish woods, the occurrence of ancient trees in Europe, first of all, has declined precipitately in the last century due to commercialization of wood extraction from forests and the lack of old growth, old stage trees within those forests. A high proportion of Saproxylic Coleoptera are therefore affected, as they are associated disproportionately with ancient trees. If you curtail the age structure of forests, it has a very big and adverse effect upon the Saproxylic fauna. I'll explain the word Saproxylic in a moment or two. Old woods are the best woods, but also the scarcest and most endangered. Just to give an example of age, the oldest oak known in Ireland, as far as I'm aware, somebody could correct me on this, is an oak within Beaver Forest in Belfast, which has been dated to 1640 or thereabouts. If you compare that with Britain, using tree ring technology, again, the oldest oak is estimated to have begun life around 970 CE, a very considerable difference. And this is due to the history of Ireland and the way it's being colonized and utilized by foreign powers, let's say, Britain in particular, over the years. Northern Ireland does still have a number of veteran trees, such as oak, which are very important in terms of overall forest biodiversity. Most of our 19th century estates still have substantial holdings of these trees, but I worry very much because the rate at which they are being decimated by health and safety initiatives, by tree surgeons who are anything but, and local councils who view short-term expediency as important rather than long-term sustainability. When bogs are cut across the island of Ireland, it quite often reveals the extent of former forest occurrence across the island. Here you can see a fossil oak on the shores of Drumlochar Loch in Armagh and fossil Scots pine in Brackeriley Bog in County Londonderry. If one looks very briefly at a history of woods in Ulster, before significant human intervention, the forest cover had to deal with massive changes in climate at the end of the boreal period, which is basically settled, warm and dry, at the beginning of the Atlantic period, which brought in ferocious storms from the Atlantic and a substantial increase in precipitation so that forests across Ireland were blown flat. And you can see the direction of the winds because the crowns of the trees all face east, showing that the wind was westerly. And these were in turn developed or enveloped in mosses in the very wet conditions, and eventually became peat bogs. So when the peat bogs are extracted, you see the remains of former forests. When human beings came along, the large forests that would exist across parts of Western Ireland had long gone. The Normans were the first conquerors, if you like, from about 1100 CE. And they came at a time of forest regrowth because the human population had declined in previous centuries, allowing the woodlands to recover to a degree. But they didn't have much impact on the landscape. There are only two known major forests produced by the Normans. They had a different idea of forests from the traditional one. They enclosed spaces to encourage deer so that they could hunt them. And the sort of holdings that they had were very diffuse forest settlements with well-spaced trees and what we would now classify as wood pasture. There was the Great Wood near Parscourt and the Great Wood of Coilochram in County Carlow, none, however, in Ulster. The Elizabethan plantation caused significant damage, in fact, to existing woodlands during the first period of settlement, and there wasn't much planting done until the second plantation, the Scots-Irish plantation. Much of the better land, actually, to be honest, was handed over to these settlers who enclosed it and set about replanting the now much diminished woodlands. By 1800, however, the amount of forest cover in Ireland was estimated at about 0.5% of the total land area, and probably as little as 0.2%. Most of this, unfortunately, was in poor condition, and it was mainly 19th century planting that has produced the wooded landscape that we see today. So on to, from woodland to saproxylic invertebrates, the subject of my talk today. Invertebrates that are dependent on dead or decaying wood, or on other organisms that are themselves dependent on decaying wood, or saproxylic. These may not be dependent on wood for the primary life cycle or the entire life cycle, but some stage must be associated with dead wood. I just want to list a few information sources for those of you who are interested in this concept of saproxylic invertebrates, Saproxylic Coleoptera in particular. The first major work that appeared on this was Alexander, 2002, Invertebrates of Living and Decaying Timber in Britain and Ireland. It's not obtainable even online at the moment, as far as I'm aware, but if anybody wants a copy, I have one on my memory stick here. If you wish to identify this range of invertebrates that we call saproxylic, then there's no better book than a self-published Beetles of Britain of Ireland and Ireland, Volume 3 by Andrew Duff, but it's expensive at about 110 pounds. In 2012, Keith Alexander published with myself an account of the beetles of decaying wood in Ireland, which is still pretty well a good enough reference point. But a lot of things have happened since then, and I've summarized these in a publication done for Buglife last year, Annotated Checklist of Northern Ireland Saproxylic Coleoptera, which again, if you want to see that, I have it on my memory stick. Finally, UK beetles is a useful reference for background information on these groups, and NBN maps can be consulted for distribution maps. So measuring the quality of woodlands against this saproxylic measure is the next subject. First of all, important sites in Northern Ireland. Keith Alexander in 2006 published a resume of site conditions and fauna for what he called wood pasture, which is the best kind of habitat for saproxylic insects, which has good spaced trees with lots of ground in between, usually grazed, grassland systems, in fact. Castlereagh, Glenarm, Drenna, Baronscote, Caledon, and Castlecool were all surveyed by Alexander during that work. More recent work, myself, Mike, Brian, and others, Beaver Park, Tynan, Racewood, Parknor, Lenmore, Colebrook, Cromcastle, Florence Court, and Castle Caldwell. Saproxylic indices for these sites. I have to say a little bit about that. Saproxylic scores were defined for every saproxylic taxon in Britain in 1999 by Files et al. In the Journal of the Coleopterist. I have a copy here if anybody wants to have a look at it. There are about 650 species listed. That compares with an Irish list of Saproxylic Coleoptera, which I composed recently, about 230. So the Irish fauna is approximately 35% of the British fauna. It's quite a low percentage. In most invertebrate groups, the percentage of Irish versus British is between 60 and 70%. So it's half of what it really should be. And what I told you about forest history really defines how low this value is. Numbers of saproxylic species collected, identified at individual sites, are added to give a measure called total of Saproxylic species recorded, or SPP. Scores from Fowles et al. Are applied to each species in the list and are additive to give another measure called SQS, total of Saproxylic scores for a site. And finally, you divide one by t'other as SQS over SPP, get Saproxylic quality index, SQI, which is SQS divided by SPP times 100%. SQR is reliant upon high individual scores overall, indicative of rarity and specialization. The bigger the total that you get, the better the habitat in theory, although there are some caveats to that. Looking at the Saproxylic index, which I've calculated for sites across Northern Ireland, this took quite a bit of time because it meant extracting all the records I had, applying Saproxylic quality scores, and doing that little calculation in the previous slide. We ended up with SQIs of ranging from 168 to 531. The SQS values are not really terribly important. The SPP, the number of species recorded at each site, is vitally indicative of the quality of the site for Saproxylic insects. And you can see that the highest value is actually held by Crom Castle, and that will surprise no one, I think. The highest value for SQI, however, is 534 as an insignificant little glen just west of it called Glenmore ASSI. Now, there is a good reason for that. And part of the reason for this talk is to explore why these values are as they are. SQI may not always provide certainty about the richest sites. The reason is quite simple, because you may have a disproportionate number of species in a given site, which are what I call big hitters, that have a much higher Saproxylic score than the rest. If you had a disproportionate number of big hitters in a site, you will get a very high value for SQI, which may not be justified in the greater field. Crom Castle is a large site, for instance, with a great variety of woodland types and the highest SPP and SQS values, but its SQI is moderate at 330 or so. SQI at Crom, therefore, though relatively small, is, in my opinion, undisturbed by these disproportionately high scores from individual species. So one then leads to the question of what are big hitters? Is there anything one can do to define them? Well, a particular genus came to notice quite early on. It's called Giraffina. Giraffina are tiny little LBJs of the family Staphylinidae that live on fungi. So the connection to Saproxylic is indirect. The fungi live on the roots of trees. The fungi cause decay processes in dead wood, and the Giraffina species feed on the spores of these fungal species. There are 9 species in this particular study of about 15 Irish Giraffina compared to 31 species in Britain. So the actual percentage of Giraffina as that of Britain is about 72%, which is really high for a group like ground beetles, which are extremely well known in Ireland. The percentage of ground beetle species as a proportion of the British fauna is about 65%. So these species are a little bit more abundant in terms of species and actual individuals in Ireland than Britain. If the species were equivalent in terms of range and rarity between the two islands, you would expect the SQS value to reflect in the number of sites recorded for a particular species. So Agaricocera latissima, which is actually very closely related to Giraffina, and I've included for that reason, has an SQS of 2. In Britain, that means local, nothing more than local. But there are 10 sites here, so that's more or less what you would expect. Giraffina bihamata, similarly 2 and 5. But then things start to go off, because with Giraffina congrua, you have an SQS of 8, meaning rare in Britain, against 5 sites here, which is a very small country compared to the total area of Britain. You would expect many fewer sites in our land area than are recorded here. Similarly for Garifuna joyi, Garifuna manca, and then we come back to normal with Garifuna minima 2 and 4. And then things really get out of hand because Garifuna munsteri, which is given a score of 16 in the British fauna, meaning very rare, extremely localized, possibly endangered, equates to 6 sites in Northern Ireland, and Garifuna pulchella, 9 sites, again with an SQS of 16. So what you're saying is that species which are rare in Britain are relatively common here. How can we explain that? Let's look at the species then. Those are the 8 Garifuna that I mentioned in the previous slide. If we look at these guys, you begin to wonder, how do you tell these things apart? They all look identical. And this is typical of Staphylinid genera and Staphylinid species. And the reason why Staphylinidae are not a very popular subject among people who are interested in invertebrates, because you have a high degree of similarity and you have difficulties of identification. These animals are only 1.5 to 2.5 millimeters long. The shortest one on that, not working, anyway. The shortest one is minima, and the longest one is pulchella. You can actually judge that from the scale bars, which are 1 millimeter. Tiny little things. If you take a growing fungus, and they usually go for larger fleshy fungi like gill fungi, and break it up on a white dish, you get dozens of these little things running around. You then have to kill them, set them, dissect them to identify what you're looking at. But hey, there is a solution to the problem, because when you look at the EDA guy of these insects, they are disproportionately large to the size of the insect. If you look at the scale bars again, you can see that. And the shape, contour of each is highly individual, making it, if you dissect them, very easy to discriminate between the species and therefore identify what you're working with. So although Mike pollutes the life out of me by sending me thousands of these things, I don't find it a great trial to identify them, compile the data, and produce results from that data. So what affects the success of Garifuna? This may give some clue to what is really going on here. Basically, a reliable food supply is essential for any species, and particularly this group. Remember what they have to do. They have to arrange their life cycle so that the adults appear, pupate, and hatch from pupae at exactly the right time that the fungi are appearing on the forest floor in order to feed in the fungal spores. So a reliable food source is essential. This is Garifuna manca feeding on the underside, the spore-bearing side of dryad saddle. Most species are adaptable and feed on a variety of larger fleshy fungi, but exceptions include most bracket fungi are not suitable, Russula species are not suitable, Boletus species are not suitable. Small abundant species are favored because they can rely more exactly upon these appearing year after year, despite whatever prevailing weather conditions are present. Rhodocolibia, Marasmus, Agaricus mycena would be genera that are particularly good for Garifuna species. So what might negatively affect the Garifuna populations in Britain as compared to Ireland, if that is what is going on? Well, too much of this. Basically, fungi collecting. Foraging is quite a common pastime in Britain. People in Ireland really, by and large, are not interested, except for the odd come along. I've seen people coming out of Peatlands Park dragging bags, great bin bags full of mixed fungi without even bothering to sort them. They drag them all back to some center, then sort them there, whether they're edible or not. Most of them get thrown away, but with that bag of fungi goes the life history of a lot of Garaphena. And if this occurs in a wide scale from people who are just simply foraging, then you can see that the prospects for a lot of these species is quite grim. And that explains in large part why the scores for some of these species in Britain are so high and therefore give SQI values a big boost when you're assessing similar habitats in Ireland, which have got relatively undisturbed fungal populations, which are supplying food to these insects on a regular basis. Disturbance also affects it. People just kicking fungi over, indiscriminate collecting. These are the things that we think may impact on Garaphena and as a critical part of the richness, the biodiversity of Saproxylic type habitats. If I take Garaphena out of the equation, you can produce a list like this with SQI minus Garaphena and see that the SQI values have come down quite a bit from what they would have been previously. Some are very similar because there are no Garaphena recorded in those woods in the first place, but others have come down quite significantly. So these tiny insects have a disproportionate influence upon measurements of quality in woodlands where Saproxylic fauna are being examined. And there are wider implications. If you look at the top 4 entries there from Northern Ireland, compare it with the only other part of Ireland that I have a figure for, Clarke National Park. I've been working there for the last 2 years. The SQI is 333, which is reasonable. The number of species recorded 115 at Clarke, but look at the figures for Northern Ireland, 19, 22, 29, 39, nowhere near that number. And if you look at habitats in Britain, the best habitat is Windsor Great Park with an SQI of 847 and a total species report of 365. Richmond Park, 643 and 235, Mappus Park, 638 and 241. In other words, Irish habitats are 2/3 poorer than British habitats, which is what you would expect from the history of woodland in Ireland. But yet we get these high SQI values from the disproportionate importance of the small fungal spore feeders, Garaphena. However, I still think we should conserve what we have, principally because new species are arriving at a steady rate in Ireland. While our fauna is poor, it's slowly improving as time goes on because of global warming, believe it or not. A number of interesting additions have been recorded in recent years. Overlooked species, obviously, there's always a possibility of that because the Irish fauna is not being nearly as well studied as that in Britain or in Europe. Those that appear by natural dispersal from Britain, which is an increasing influence upon our own fauna. With global warming, we tend to get these settled periods of anticyclonic weather in spring with winds from the east, which will disperse any aerial plankton from Britain onto the Irish landscape and therefore allow for settlement of new species. Introduction of potentially invasive aliens has always been a possibility. We have ties, horticultural ties, close horticultural ties with New Zealand. So accidental introduction from that source is always possible through garden centres, and introduction with timber products. Just to give you 1 or 2 examples very quickly, this species was overlooked for many years because it is a winter species and only appears during the winter months. This species was overlooked for many years, but when we've done recent surveys, from the data that's appeared in previous slides, you can see it's quite widely distributed. So one has to conclude that it's not a recent immigrant, but a well-settled native that has just been simply overlooked. And the final species that I'm listing here, Dorcatoma, occurs in two spots in Ireland, Lismore in County Waterford and Cromcastle in County Fermanagh, and it breeds and lives in alder bracket, very rarely ever examined by entomologists. You have to collect alder bracket and keep it in boxes for a period of time until the insects pupate and emerge to identify what's there. There are species, of course, which are expanding the ranges. This is one, Zygonium quadricorni, and quadricorni refers to the, just trying to get this thing to work. Nope. Give up. The male at the top has got these four horns at the front of its head. It's quite an interesting arrangement, really. The females don't. And this species has turned up in a number of places around Belfast in recent years, having previously only been recorded from the extreme south of Ireland. The second species for which this is true is the malachite beetle, very southern in Ireland until extremely recently, and now recorded at Old Combe Castle during June 2021. We see a lot more of that, including a lot of other species which are benefiting from warming of the climate. Natural dispersal of from Britain also accounts for the presence of species like these. I'll not go into each individual case, but the most spectacular one in recent years has been the longhorn Stictoleptura rubra, the red longhorn, which has appeared in sites across Ireland from Wicklow through to Galway to Fermanagh, and now in Belfast. It's been found in the garden in Belfast. These breed in rotting pine wood, if you're interested. So if you have old pine trees in the garden, there's a reasonable prospect of coming across them. The adults feed on flowers and can be easily spotted in gardens. The larvae tunnel pine wood, and that's their connection with the Saproxylic concept. Aliens, well, we get aliens because we have such a strong horticulture link to New Zealand. Whole plants are imported to garden centres, and with those come root balls in which you may find interesting beetles, interesting to me, but very not particularly interesting from an invasive point of view. These two ironclad beetles are examples of species which have appeared in recent years. One hasn't made it further than Mount Stewart Gardens in County Down. The other one is spread much more widely. One comes from New Zealand, the other from Australia. And this little weevil is one of the commonest weevils in Ireland now, having been introduced from New Zealand. It's only about 3.5 millimeters long, but it occurs ubiquitously under bark on dead trees and in dead wood of all kinds. And finally, an accidentally introduced species. The reason I say accidentally introduced, this species, the tanbark beetle, a large longhorn beetle, occurs in oak limbs, particularly in Britain in piles of oak logs that have been sitting there for use of different kinds. And I suspect it's been imported to the only site so far known in Ireland, Tyne Abbey in County Armagh. I was there with Mike Bryan, and Mike was examining a large limb of oak which had splintered and hit the ground and was still attached to the tree. And he said, look at that, holes in the bark and into the dead center of the tree. And out of these came insects like you see here. I thought at first, we've got something else. We've got trick beetles or possibly soldier beetles, but no, it turned out to be the tanbark borer. I have no idea what the status of these is at present, but that illustrates the range of additions to the fauna that have been occurring in recent years. And as I say, the Saproxylic fauna of Ireland currently is poor, but it's improving with time. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions? Oh, right at the back there. Yeah. Oh, try to.
Thanks very much. It's great talk, very interesting. I'm just curious, out of this group, the Saproxylic group, is there any endemics you just find on this island? And if there is, what's their conservation status?
Sadly, no endemics. Not even any near endemics, i.e. subspecies that might be regarded as endemics in a future era when the taxonomy changes and so forth. All I can tell you is groups like Giraffina, which are specialized in a particular area of Saproxylic activity, seem to be doing well in Ireland compared to Britain and indeed to Europe. The genus Giraffina, 15 Irish species, 31 British, 45 European. That's a very good percentage for such a small area of land like Ireland. So it's something to be aware of and take care of, if you like. There are other groups that I can mention which have a similar status. There is a staphylinid called Ephemeroptera crassicornis, which has one British record from 1967 at Malham in Yorkshire, but which we've discovered in about 20 locations in the west of not just Northern Ireland, but also Southern Ireland. I've taken it down in Clarke and various other places. So we have elements of our fauna which are important. This would be regarded as a northern element, Ephemeroptera crassicornis, because it's well distributed in Scandinavia, but not well distributed in Western or Central Europe. So yes, there are specialisms within our fauna that are important and unusual, but no endemics.
So we should ask for one or two more questions, and then we can go outside.
Yes,
That's better.
I was interested to see the Giraffina, which are more common in Ireland than in Britain. And this is something I've seen in other invertebrates, and it makes it really hard to choose indicators and prioritize species in Ireland. Because, for example, some of the Northern Irish conservation areas are managed by English-centered organizations, but we're looking mainly at Irish data. So I'm wondering what your take on that would be. How can we improve our prioritization of species and choice of indicators of species, given that the distribution can be so different between Ireland and the UK as a whole?
Yes, this is a problem that has cropped up repeatedly when trying to designate priority species, because for a very long time, the cue was taken from English Nature, what they had prioritized, and these were automatically added to our priority list when it wasn't actually justified, because the distribution and preponderance of a lot of species is, as you point out, quite different in Ireland from Britain. Unfortunately, I am guilty as much as anyone of not taking proper cognizance of this. The Giraffina species, none of them are actually on the priority list in Northern Ireland, but perhaps we should put them there. And the reason they're not is because they're not particularly rare here, but their status in Britain would be ample justification for including them in consideration for red lists or priority species lists.
Yeah, any other final questions?
Hi, Ray.
Hi,
To what
Eddie.
extent do you think the weather might play a part in fungal fruiting and therefore something to feed on?
Well, the lesson, yeah, I thought this might come up. The lesson is that if you look at the fungal fruiting patterns in Europe, the most of the species that are collected for food seem to be far more predictable than they are in Ireland. So it's a difficult one to make a judgment on. Is weather important? It may be, but I have no evidence of that. In fact, these species that I've been referring to seem rather indifferent to weather. So long as the small fungi appear, that's it. That's their sole focus in life. Weather is neither here nor there. The larger boletes and russulas and lots of other species which might be collected for food in Europe don't feature in the food program of the Giraffina. But certainly the Giraffina are a lot rarer, I would guess, in Europe than they are in Ireland. Mike Bryan has a house in France near Nice, and he regularly brings back stuff, you guessed it, for me to identify. And I've only ever seen 2 species of Giraffina from the district he lives in, which is quite a nice area. So I can only conclude from that for various reasons, the Irish fauna Giraffina is just a bit more rich generally than it would be in either Britain or Europe. And it may be connected to the propensity of Europeans to utilize every fungal resource available to them at the expense of these little species.
Yeah, thank you.